Hi friends, welcome back to the Paradigm Quilt Sew Along. We are now on week 4 of the sew along. So if you are just finding this video, make sure you check out the whole sew along playlist, which I'll link for you right here. During week 1, we picked out our fabrics. During week 2, we cut the fabrics and made our 4 corner units. Last week, during week 3, we made our center economy quilt block. And this week we are diving into making our Flying Geese and our Flying Geese units. So if you are just joining, welcome. Feel free to use these videos to follow along at your own pace. But if you are sewing along with me here in February 2022, I want to say I have really enjoyed seeing your photo progress on Instagram. And our prize sponsor for this week is Brown Eyed Quilter. One lucky winner is going to get free long arm quilting services from Brown Eyed Quilter for their Paradigm Quilt top. If you want to be entered to win long arm quilting, make sure you just post a photo of your progress this week on Instagram using hashtag ParadigmSAL. That stands for Paradigm Sew Along. All right, let's dive into making our Flying Geese. The Paradigm Quilt Pattern teaches you how to make flying geese using the 4 at a time method. If you are brand new to quilting, or maybe you've just never tried the 4 at a time method, I do have a full tutorial linked right here for how to make flying geese using this particular method. But of course the pattern does show you step by step, and I'm going to show you today as well. The 4 at a time method is one of my favorites because there is no fabric waste other than the little bits that we trim off. We do cut our pieces a little oversized and we'll square them up, cutting off any excess. So definitely try to be as precise as possible, but we will cut them down to size once we finish sewing. For our flying geese, we'll actually be making 16 flying geese for the Paradigm quilt. 8 of them will be color 3 and 8 of them will be color 4. So in this example, I'm just going to show you using color 3, but make sure that once you make your first batch, you go through and make all of your flying geese, and then we'll also make our flying geese units, which is where we sew our flying geese to each other. And that step is written in the pattern for you as well. All right, let's dive in. Go ahead and grab 4 piece E background squares and 1 piece D, either color 3 or color 4, and let's get started. The first step will be to mark a diagonal line on all of your background squares. And I am going to use this heat erasing pen, which I will put a link for in the description below. If you don't have any heat erasing pens, I definitely recommend them for this type of marking when quilting. You could also use a pencil, marking chalk, or even your iron if you want to fold it diagonally and press. So feel free to use whatever marking method you choose, but I'll be using this pen. I have here 4 piece E background squares, but if you want to mark all 16 at one time, you can definitely do that. These will all be the identical piece E squares. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab one at a time and put my ruler on the diagonal, and then grab my heat erasing pen and mark that line. As you're marking your squares, make sure to mark on the wrong side of the fabric. As I'm using a solid, the right side is going to go face down. The wrong side is the side that you will see as you're sewing. So go ahead and grab 2 of your pieces that you have the diagonal marked and your 1 piece D. You should have 4 piece D squares. 2 of them are color 3 and 2 are color 4. So just grab one of them for now and take 2 piece E squares and line them up so that your diagonal lines go straight across. And I'm going to grab some pins and pin them in place. Now you should have 1 diagonal line that goes all the way across. We're going to take this over to our sewing machine and stitch a 1/4 inch on each side of the line. When you get to a pin, make sure you stop and you take it out so you don't sew over the pins. And when you've stitched on one side of the line, just go ahead and turn it around and sew down the other side of the line. When you're done sewing, it should look something like this. Our next step is to trim directly on that straight line that we have drawn. So go ahead and line up your ruler and take your rotary cutter and cut on the line. Now you should have 2 pieces with a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each piece. Next, we'll take these over to our ironing board. For each piece, go ahead and set the seam with your hot iron, which just means press it nice and flat. And then we'll go ahead and press the seams open. Make sure you also use your best press on this step too to get that seam nice and crisp. Now you should have 2 pieces just like this, and we'll go ahead and pin one of these remaining piece E squares onto each of these pieces. Line it up so that the diagonal line cuts across and points into the center of that little heart shape, and pin this into place. I'll kind of show you how this is going to make 2 flying geese here. This side is going to fold up, and there's your flying geese. And then the same thing's going to happen on this side as well. And there's your flying geese. So we're going to stitch a 1/4 inch on each side of this line. And we're going to repeat the same thing for our other piece. When you're done sewing both pieces, go ahead and trim on the center line. Now you should have 2 on the right side and 2 on the left side, and we'll go ahead and press these seams open as well. So the first thing I'll do is set the seam, and then I'll go ahead and flip it over and press this seam open just like the other ones. Once you press the seam open, you should be able to check out and take a look at your 1/4 inch seam allowance between the point of your geese and the end of the block. We're going to end up trimming it down, but that seam allowance right there is super important to keep in mind for later. I want to share a little secret with you if you are making 4 at a time flying geese. Go ahead, once you've finished pressing, and take a look inside this little corner seam. You might be able to find a little tiny piece of fabric. And if you go ahead and take those little triangles out, it'll help reduce the bulk when you sew these pieces together. So go ahead and just look inside your seam and see if you can find a piece that comes out really easily when you pull it. Next up, we are going to trim our flying geese. If you are making the throw size like I am, your flying geese will be pretty massive. So I recommend using a super large ruler that will be bigger than your flying geese. If you are making the baby size, it'll be a little bit simpler, and if you're making the pillow size, it's super easy, and there's actually a flying geese ruler I would recommend you use called the Wing Clipper by Deb Tucker, and I'll go ahead and link that in the description below. I show how to use it in my flying geese tutorial, and I definitely recommend it for making smaller flying geese. But since these flying geese are super large and they're really not all that common in the quilt world, we're just going to use a rectangular ruler. As I mentioned earlier, the most important part is making sure that you keep your seam allowance at your point of your geese. And the other 2 important parts to keep in mind are the corner seams of each geese. So I'll show you how to line those up using just a regular rectangular ruler. The Paradigm Quilt Pattern will show you exactly what size your flying geese should be trimmed to. So I'm going to go ahead and reference that as I'm trimming for my throw size. So you'll go ahead and make sure that the height and the width are both, you have overage on all 4 sides. You should have just a tiny bit, not much, as you trim. And you're going to want to make sure that you have a 1/4 inch between the point of your flying geese and the edge, and that both of your corner seams are directly in line with one of your dots for a 1/4 inch line. So I'll go ahead and line up first the dot at the top and the dot on the side and trim the side and the top. Cutting off that little dog ear at the top and just a little bit extra. You'll see there's not a ton that gets trimmed off. Next, I'll rotate the flying geese around so that I can trim the remaining 2 sides. And this time I'm going to line up the end and the bottom with the measurements that are listed in your pattern. And then I'm also going to take a look at the corners and make sure that those are as close to perfect as possible. And then I'll go ahead and trim. And again, you'll notice there's not a ton that gets trimmed off, but just making these small trims makes it nice and ready to sew together. While you're trimming, if you're ever in doubt that maybe it's not lining up properly, definitely err on the side of caution and trim off less than you think that you should. You can always go back and trim more if needed. So once you've trimmed 1 flying geese, go ahead and trim the rest. Once you've made your first 4 flying geese, go ahead and repeat that process 3 more times to make 16 flying geese total for your Paradigm quilt top. Once you've made all 16 flying geese, you're ready to transition over to making the flying geese units. So check for that section in your Paradigm pattern. For each unit, you're going to grab 2 color 3 flying geese and 2 color 4 flying geese. The first thing that we'll do is stitch our 2 of the same color right sides together with the geese pointing in the same direction. I'll go ahead and flip them so that we have right sides together, and then I'm going to pin them in place along the short end. So line up your diagonal seam and start there and then pin across your short end, and we're going to stitch this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Do that for color 4 as well as color 3. When you go to sew your 2 flying geese together, I like to start at the side that has the 2 seams together. That's where you're going to have the most bulk. So you're going to want to go slowly to get over that bulk nice and smoothly. And once you're past that, it should be fairly easy. Once you get to the end, you cut your pieces apart, and then we can check our seam and see if they come together with a nice crisp point. So you should see the seams come together fairly close with a 1/4 inch of seam allowance. And the next thing we'll do is press these seams open. And again, using best press at that seam where the bulk is to make sure that it gets nice and flat. Once we've pressed color 3 and color 4, we're going to sew these pieces together to make our flying geese unit. So go ahead and arrange them so that your color 3 geese are pointing towards your color 4 geese, and arrange them right sides together and start to pin them in place starting at the center seams, matching those up. We'll match up the center seams, and then we'll go ahead and take a look over and try to match up the ends as close as we can and pin that in place. And then we'll pin in the center of each geese, and maybe you'll add a couple extra pins as well. Now we will stitch this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You're going to want to be extra careful when you're stitching over where that bottom flying geese point comes so that you don't get any tucks in the seam allowance behind it. Next, we can flip our piece over and take a look and see if our seam hits that little point of our flying geese. Ideally, the seam will be right above the point of the fabric. Now we'll press the seam open. This is another opportunity where I recommend setting your seam. So before you open up the seam, just press it with a hot iron, and that'll get everything nice and flat before you actually open it up. And now we press it just like we have all of the other seams, doing a nice gentle finger press, and then bringing the nice hot iron and getting those seams where the Flying Geese point comes nice and crisp. I want to take a few moments for those of you that might be using AccuQuilt to make your Flying Geese. You do not use the 4 at a time method if you cut using AccuQuilt. Instead, for each Flying Geese, you'll use 1 1/4 square triangle and 2 1/2 square triangles. So you'll start off by stitching right sides together, the 1/2 square triangle to one of the short ends of your 1/4 square triangle, and then you'll stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance, press that seam open, and then you'll add the other side, and then you'll be done with your Flying Geese. You can then sew those into the Flying Geese units without even having to trim. If you are new to AccuQuilt, or maybe you want some tips for precise piecing, I do have a really great tutorial about how to make perfect 1/2 square triangles using AccuQuilt, and all of those tips apply for the Flying Geese as well. So be sure to check that out. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Once you've finished making 4 Flying Geese units like this one, you are done with week 4 of the Paradigm Sew Along. I cannot wait to see your progress for the week over on Instagram. If you have any questions this week that maybe I didn't answer in this video, go ahead and drop them in a comment below and I'll reply. I can't wait to see you back here next week for week 5 of the Paradigm Sew Along, where we sew all of these big blocks together and finish our quilt top. Happy sewing!